Surely the flying of moths is a behavioral adaptation underlain by phylogenetically determined adaptations. Yet, their sensory apparatuses, which are adapted to the moon as a stimulus, maladaptively guide moths towards porch lights which are for them supernormal releasing patterns. How can this be accounted for if adaptations always result in adaptive behavior?
Very simply, adaptations can only be said to be adaptations in the environment in which they evolved.
This is the adaptation versus adaptiveness problem we have discussed before.
Flying towards the brightest light source, which was the moon, is a behavioral adaptation that evolved in moths prior to human-made electric lights. As a result, what was once a behavioral adaptation in the environment of evolutionary adaptiveness or adaptiveness, called the EEI, is now a behavioral maladaptation. Note, however, that I am attributing the origin of an observable behavior that can be defined both by its form/structure as well as by its function to the EEI. I am not attributing an invisible middle module to that time period.
Is it not possible that flying is a behavioral adaptation, while the maladaptation is the moth's sensory apparatus? It would then follow that the flying is a behavioral adaptation which in the current environment can be maladaptive, while the moth's sensory apparatus is a maladaptation. For example, the behavior adaptation, flying, would be adaptive if the moth were following a pheromone trail or navigating. Yet, this behavior adaptation would be maladaptive if in the course of its flight it encountered a street light because the moth's sensory system is not adapted to environments containing man-made lights. Otherwise, both the behavior adaptation and the sensory apparatus could be either maladaptive or, by your definition, maladaptations. Additionally, I would point out that you have defined a behavior not by its form/structure and proximate use function but by its form/structure and a function of a function. Specifically, you stated that the moth is flying towards the brightest light. Flying, or moving through the air, is a proximate function of a moth's behavior. Flying toward a light and flying toward a pheromone are the function of a function. Also, there are traits that are not behaviors but are adaptations.
Yes, for sure. Behaviors, movements, or their results or outcome constitute only a very small fraction, perhaps less than 1%, of all the structural design features that are adaptations that can be present in a living organism.
It is interesting that so much is required to achieve the greatest masterwork of nature, behavior, and yet, behavior is so infrequently the object of study. Especially human behavior. Can an adaptationist stance be applied to such characters?
Yes, with the same risk of being wrong as when the adaptationist stance is applied to mental attributes, which are attributes having to do with cognition that are defined only by their function, or what they do. The classical examples of structural characters are the webs between the human fingers. They're called spandrels, which means unintended byproducts of Darwinian natural selection.
This is the problem of just so stories. I thought that humans had webs between their fingers to provide a comforting fit when their hands are clasped when engaging in partitioning prayer, because it would have been adaptive if partitioning prayer is adaptive if their fingers were more, rather than less, comfortable, as it would facilitate partitioning prayer. And so on. On a more serious note, I previously read some of the conversations between you and James Gray when you modified your definition of behavior to this: behavior is movements or their result or outcome. Have you considered the disjunctive syllogism applied to your new definition? Correct me if I am mistaken. When a function is defined as the result of at least two structures interacting when at least one of those structures is a part of an organism, and to define behavior as movement or result, by commutation can be stated as behavior is result or movement, and then, by negation, behavior is not movement, therefore, behavior is result, or worse yet, behavior is function. Some might interpret your definition to mean, behavior is function. But that is not compatible with classical ethology, since behavior should be defined or at least described by form and function and not by function only. Your modified definition of behavior could even include invisible mental modules. That is why I prefer the previous version. Behavior is the movement of an individual.